Round number 2 of the 2022 Sinquefield Cup. This is the recap. This event is played in St. Louis, Missouri. It's 10 players, single round robin, 90 minutes for 40 moves, 30-minute bonus at move 40, and a 30-second increment throughout the full game. This has 10 of the top players in the world. 8 of these players are in the top 11 in the world. That just tells you what caliber of players we're looking at here. And we're going to jump into the first game. Hans Niemann with the white pieces against Shakramir Mamedyarov with the black pieces. And the cool thing with this game is we have Hans Niemann from the US, a young player. He's 2687, getting to play against some of these super GMs. So we see in English with e5. This is called the reverse Sicilian variation. Knight f6, knight f3. Now this is what's called the four knights variation, and now we see e4 by Hans. Essentially, this looks like an e4, e5 opening, with the exception of this pawn sitting on c4. And if we look at the opening database, the stats are about as we would expect, just a slight advantage for white. Bishop c5, we're still following a couple hundred games. And now we have this tactic, knight takes e5, and we see this in double king pawn openings as well. When the knight takes back, there's a fork. Black has to give back a piece. b4. Hans wins the piece back, and now we're even material. Queen f3, putting a second defender here. And now this is an interesting imbalance. You might be wondering, why does white want to accept double pawns here? The reason it's okay to have the double pawns here is because white has other imbalances in his favor. So white has extra space with this pawn on e5. And if you look at the black king side, this is a bit exposed. The queen's already on f3, the bishop's pointing here. This bishop wants to come to d3, pointing here. And you can start to see an attack forming for white. And black kind of wishes that he had a knight on f6 to help defend the king side. Or maybe at least has that dark square bishop over to help out. Bishop f4. Now we're down to 9 games, so essentially we're getting close to these players being on their own territory. If you look at the clocks, they're still about an hour and a half each. Castle for black. Queenside castle by Hans. When I saw this move, this really surprised me, but this is exciting chess by Hans Niemann. Hans is an online blitz specialist. He's really good at attacking chess, playing quickly, playing intuitively, and he is not afraid of the super grandmaster Mamedyarov, who has been over 2,800 FIDE. Queenside castle, queen e7 trying to come in, and king to b2, using the king to defend that a3 square from the black queen. Rook b8, trying to line it up with white's king. Queen to e3. And now we see a small mistake by Schach. Pawn to b5 is the best move, trying to trade off b5 for c4, opening up the rook to the king. For some reason, he goes a little bit defensive with pawn to b6. And now we see Hans start to generate an attack. Bishop to d3, pointing over here at the king side. Queen e6, and now queen g3. Rook e1. So look at what Hans is doing. Every single piece is getting developed. Now we see pawn to b5. And this is interesting because the strongest move according to the engine is c takes b5. But this looks scary for any human to play. a6 could be played, c6 could be played, and you see that rook lined up with the king. So Hans plays the natural move c5. But this does give Schach an advantage after pawn to b4, because now these pawns are about to trade off. And after c4, b3 can be played. So Mamedyarov just keeps pushing the pawn, pushing the pawn, pushing the pawn, trying to expose Hans's king. And you would think the move to be played here is pawn to a3 to lock it up. But the problem is this b pawn push opened up the attack on the rook on e1. So bishop takes e1 could be played here, and white really doesn't have any compensation for being down the exchange. So here Hans plays a takes b3. Now we still see bishop takes e1. So Hans does have a pawn for the exchange, but really it's an advantage for black at this point. And if you look at the clocks, Hans is down to 23 minutes. So this was something that we saw in round number 1. Hans spent a lot of time. And this is something that we see from Alexander Grischuk, who's also very good at blitz. He'll spend a ton of time in classical and then just try to blitz things out when he gets under pressure on the clock. Pawn to a5 by black. Bishop back to d2. And On to a5 actually kind of turns in the tides. d6 or d5 would have been better, trying to trade off one of these c pawns, expose this king a little bit more. But it just shows how complex this position is. White now has a small advantage. Bishop a6, queen h4, threatening that h-pawn. We see queen and bishop both lined up. On to g6 to defend. Queen d4, rook b7. Now bishop takes a5. So Hans has 2 pawns for the exchange now. And this pawn mass actually looks pretty solid for white. This pawn's doing a good job. And we've talked about this before in round number 1. White does have the bishop pair. The bishop pair is a big deal at the Super Grandmaster level. Let's see if Hans can utilize them. Rook e to b8, threatening this pawn. On to b4. So now there's a big choice by Mamedyarov, and he makes the correct decision. He plays rook takes b4, and essentially you have to take that. If you don't, there's no way to crack open white's king side position, or actually it's the queen side, but where the king is sitting. So black has to take. Bishop takes, rook takes, king c3. Very adventurous by the king, but this has to be played. King attacks the rook, and if you look at the material count, it's +1 for Hans, which is currently a doubled pawn. Doubled and isolated. Rook b8, bishop e4. That bishop would love to head to d5, pointing at f7 and the king. Queen retreats, and there's bishop to d5. I think the best move here was bishop takes c4, queen takes c4, queen takes e5. But this just gets funky. This king is on the run, and Hans is up a bishop. So somehow Mamedyarov would have to calculate this and feel like he has enough checks to go after the white king. But you also have to factor in the clock here. 9 minutes for Hans, 53 minutes for Mamedyarov. We're at move 28. So they're not getting the bonus until move 40 when they get an extra 30 minutes. Because of that, I think Mamedyarov wants to play for the win here. Taking that pawn is essentially saying, I'm okay with perpetual check, and I'm hoping for perpetual check. I'm hoping for a draw. So that's why he plays queen e8. Bishop to d5, nice attacking square. Mamedyarov attempts to trade bishops, and we see rook to b1 by Hans. Now here, I would think taking this makes sense. Take, c takes d. Yes, Hans is up a pawn, but this king is wide open, and the queen could even come down to b1. And there's a million checks for black, and white's not creating a pass pawn yet. So I feel like there's probably really good drawing chances here for black. But instead, he plays bishop to a8. And I'm not sure if that's to increase winning chances. I'm thinking it's that he doesn't want to fix these pawns by white. But now it gives Hans a free move. And after takes, there's queen takes d7. So that free move gets Hans an extra pawn. And now that opens up the light squares. So this pawn on d7 was guarding this square. Watch this king coming up. Check. It's a pawn back. King sneaks into c6. And now we're going to see these past c pawns could become super dangerous. Hans gives up a couple pawns. Really good endgame technique. We're equal on pawns now. Hans has uglier looking pawns than black. But this c pawn is ready to march up the board with the support of the king. Queen trade offer, black cannot take it. And now we see this pawn shielding the check against the king. Hans gives up another pawn, but this whole time this has been a complete winning endgame for white with best play. And his pawn is just faster. There's nothing Mamedyarov can do. Queen to b3 check. Mamedyarov resigns. Hans Niemann takes down a super grandmaster. What a game by Hans. Let's look at the chart. 92.5 accuracy. There was just that small stretch right here in the middle where Mamedyarov had a small advantage. He had to find, found b3, but here he had to find a d pawn push after the rook trade. He needs to play d6 or d5 to gain the edge. He missed it, and the rest of the game was clear sailing by Hans. Very impressive play. He gets his first win against a super GM. Next, we'll look at Jan Nepomniachtchi with the white pieces. He lost round 1 to Magnus against Alireza Firouzja. And we see kind of this Indian setup. It can lead to an Imzo Indian, sometimes a Queen's Indian. Usually after knight f3, though, we see Queen's Gambit declined. That's what we see here. On to g3. This is the Catalan opening, and we have a ChessGoals course on this. So Jan is playing the Catalan, one of my favorite systems, and Alireza immediately takes on c4. These lines can be a bit sharper. Knight c6, queen c2, knight takes d4, so we're almost out of book now, and both players are sitting around 90 minutes. Knight takes, queen takes, knight d2. If you look at this position, Alireza has two extra pawns. What does white have for the two pawns? Well, there's this Catalan bishop on g2, doing a great job pressuring the queen side. There's both knight and queen attacking c4, and this queen is a bit of a target for rook to d1. So I would say white has full compensation for two pawns worth of activity. Pawn to c3. Alirez is saying, I'm going to give a pawn back, but I at least want you to damage your pawn structure. Separate the A and the C pawns. That move makes a lot of sense by black. And now queen c5. So he's looking for a safe square to tuck that queen away. Knight to e4. Forking queen and knight. So this is essentially forcing the knight trade. Bishop takes e4. Now, one thing I like to talk about is imbalances. You'll hear me talk about this all the time. This bishop compared to that bishop is a massive imbalance advantage for Nepomniachtchi. White's bishop is so much stronger than black's here. And if you think about what does black have in return, it's the extra pawn, which is the B pawn in this case. So can Alireza trade down to an endgame, try to neutralize that bishop advantage? And can Jan look to either win the material back because Alireza is in rough shape, or use the bishop to help attack? You can see it's pointing at h7 right now. Bishop d6, rook b1, double attack on this pawn. f5, Alireza is saying, go ahead, be my guest. You can take this pawn, and then when I take, rook takes back. He's completely fine with that because he feels that black has the initiative here. He doesn't want that initiative. He's saying, okay, just take the pawn back. We can trade off my bad bishop for your good bishop. Bishop to g2 played, castle, bishop to e3. Look at these monster bishops cutting all the way across the board. Queen a5, pawn to c4. And at this point, white's looking to play pawn to c5, defended by both bishop and queen, and that's going to cramp black's position, and there's still that b7 pawn that's hanging. Nepomniachtchi can take it really at any point. f4, not a good decision by Alireza. So Alireza is an aggressive player. He plays a lot of players that are under his rating, even players below 2,700 quite a bit. He's good at playing for the win, but in this case, he's playing a super grandmaster, probably the second best player, maybe third best player in the world, Jan Nepomniachtchi, and he's playing hyper aggressive here with pawn to f4. I'm not a fan of this move. The bishop just goes over to d4. White's rooks are connected, so black really doesn't want to open up this f-file because the a8 rook is still disconnected from the king side. What is that pawn really doing on f4? And now that bishop finds an even better diagonal. Bishop to e5, offering a trade. Queen b2 by Nepomniachtchi. Rook to d1 would have been a little bit better if the bishops trade. You can lift a rook up, attack this f-pawn. Queen b2 played, takes. And here we're sitting at close to equal. Still one extra pawn for Alireza, but white has about a pawn worth of play for it. Here, and then now we see a queen trade offer. And this is very interesting. Alireza has had difficulty in endgames in the past. I think that's part of Nepomniachtchi's game plan here. Let's take Alireza into a more, I don't know if theoretical is the right word, but kind of a practical endgame where you just need good endgame technique. And let's see what he does. King h8. Now Nepomniachtchi takes, trades here. And at this point, we see another 2 rook versus 2 rook endgame. We saw one of these yesterday. Oftentimes, these just lead to dead draws. And you look at the engine eval, engine would have you think it's a draw. Really, I wouldn't expect anything different here than a draw. But for some reason, Alireza's position starts to go downhill a little bit. One set of rooks trade off. Rook d5, get your rook active. Right? We always want active rooks in endgames. Take. Okay, pawn still even. Computer likes white a little bit better, but Alireza should be okay. Now there's this uncomfortable move, rook a5. placing the rook on this awkward c6 square, blocking a pawn. So it obviously wants to defend a6, but it doesn't really like blocking this pawn. So now we see expansion in the center by Jan, and he wants to bring the king up. And this is what I would do too. I would like to move the rook out of the way so that c pawn is free to move. The rook isn't tied down to this pawn. But look at that. The computer's saying, hey, this is already a bit of a mistake. The rook should not move away from that c pawn. And let's see why. King marches up simply to f3. And now Alireza wastes a little bit of time moving back. What should he be doing instead? He should be looking to play probably g6, h6, try to trade off one of these pawns, get these pawns off the 7th rank where they could become an issue. You just don't want to allow the white forces to push too far up the board, cramping the king. That's why I think it's good to push these up, just getting ready to trade off any white pawn that gets to the 5th rank. Okay, so Alireza kind of goes back and forth here, shuffling. f5, g4. Now we do see h6, but this king is coming up and white's position is looking good. Look at this. Alireza is just shuffling. Can't figure out what to do. Rook a4. This is the key move. White would like to push the e-pawn up the board and not allow rook to c4 check. So that's guarding the c4 square. And then look at this maneuver. c4 is a better square than a4 because now this pawn's attacked and it's really uncomfortable for black. How do you defend that pawn on c7? He now puts the king back on d8. Extremely passive by Alireza. On to e5. This is a passed pawn. Not looking good at all for black. Rook swings down to try to check from behind. But now this rook improves, threatening the a6 pawn. Rook b4 check. And look at this triangulation by Jan. Everything is defended. This is still attacked. And now we see Jan gives up the g pawn, but it puts the king on e6. There's no rook to g6 check because the pawn guards it. And this rook, if it were able to get to a8, that's already a checkmate. So the king has to move away. I was wondering what about this move, but it looks like king f7 is super strong with that passed pawn running up the board. So that's not going to work. Moves the king, rook takes, runs the king out to b7. But this passed pawn is going to be the key. f6, king takes. Now it's this passed pawn. King f7, resignation. This pawn is going to push up. Rook to e2 check does not actually help because there's rook to d3. Checking this king away. Now the pawn pushes, marches up the board. Jan Nepomniachtchi fights back, gets a win against young Alireza. Very nice endgame technique. You could tell Jan wanted that in the endgame the whole way. And look at this chart, 94 accuracy, super smooth game. The chart just keeps increasing for white. Almost perfect play by Nepomniachtchi. All right, let's go to game number 3. Here we have Fabiano with the white pieces, Dominguez Perez with the black pieces. 2 US players, they were both just in the Olympiad. We see a Petrov defense. d6, knight retreats, knight takes e4, and knight to c3. This has been trendy as of late. White accepts the double pawns, but in return, it kind of opens up nice bishop positions pointing at black's king. Bishop e3, and we see queenside castle. So it's a way to take the Petrov, which is a very solid, symmetric opening, and create some dynamic play. Fabiano wants to create winning chances. I like seeing Fabiano play this style of chess. He's been doing this a lot lately, and it's really fun to watch. So now we see h3. Let's toggle on the analysis mode. The idea here is the bishop points here. This bishop points to h6. White would like to figure out, can I get a kingside attack going? On to c5. Now, sometimes when you see a move like c5, this can change the dynamic nature of the position. Now this d pawn is a backward pawn. This pawn just left the defense of d6. Now maybe Fabiano can switch gears long term and play against this pawn. But he starts with g4, going against the black king, pawn storm. Queen a5, a3, so there's no queen takes. Pawn push, and now c4. What I like about c4 is it's slowing down black's attack. There's no c4 by black, and this is going to create a solid position on the queen side for white, with still some attacking chances on the king side. Queen to a4. Pawn to c3. B takes c. And bishop to c2. What a cool move. So this is a pawn sacrifice by Fabi. But now these pawns are stuck, and the bishop sits really nicely on c2. So think about it from Black's point of view. How many moves is it going to take for Black to crack open this structure? It's going to be b5, the queen moves, a5, b4. 1, 2, 3, 4 moves. Let's see what White can do in the meantime. g5, immediate attack. Knight to e5. Pawn to f4, threatening an immediate f5, hitting that bishop. So the knight comes here, guarding the f5 square, hitting the rook. Comes into f5. And now we see a very nice move by Fabiano. Bishop takes c5. And at first glance, it looks like bishop could just take back. But after bishop takes f5, queen to d5, it's a fork of bishop and pawn on f7. And the pawn on f7 is a fork of king and bishop. Fabi's tactics are on point. We've seen this in the candidates and in the Olympiad. Like, even though his results weren't spectacular, he's seeing some really deep tactics. He's an awesome calculator. And that's what he does here. Like, this is the line that happened in the game. Bishop moves to f2. Queen takes, king here. Queen takes f5. And after takes, even though Dominguez Perez is up the exchange for one pawn and it's +1 on the scoreboard for material, there's full compensation for Fabiano, and there's a knight and queen lingering around this king. This is even close to smothered mate style tactics. Rook to f8, blunder. So this is good practical chances for Fabi too. 39 minutes for Black, hour and 7 for Fabi. Blunder. Now at this point, queen to d7 is the engine choice. The idea is knight to f7 check. Like, let's say, just grab the pawn, knight f7. Now you have to take. If you move the king here, rook to e8 is going to be mate in 2. So you have to, you have to take. Queen takes. But now the problem is rook to e8 check is threatened. And if queen g6, this is just a terrible rook and pawn endgame for Black. This is White's game to win after rook to e7. So Fabi missed that chance, queen to d7. Instead he plays queen e4. Rook to e8, pawn to f5, still better for White. Knight c6, good move. Knight e7, attacking here, eyeing this g6 square. You can envision maybe a sacrifice with knight g6, h takes, pawn takes with queen h4, queen h7 mate. Rook here. This is the biggest miss of the game by Fabi. Pawn to f6 has to be found here. If you find pawn to f6, if this pawn push is passed, queen to e5 is a checkmate in 7 moves. Queen lines up with the king. f7 is threatened. This rook can't move here because knight takes g6 check, opens up the attack on the rook. 8 and 7 with best play. And if g6 isn't played, like let's say g takes f, now White can play g6. And this pawn's coming up to g7, busting open the king position. Again, nothing Black can do here. H takes g, queen takes g6 check. And this rook could actually lift up and over for mate. Queen to h6 check is an immediate mate threat. Mate in 5 with best play. Fabi misses pawn to f6. This was his chance to get the win. He plays queen to h4. Still slightly better, but after queen d6, really the only way to try to secure the win is this knight to g6 check. Nice move. This pawn is pinned, so the king has to move and then go for this trade and reach this queen and pawn endgame. But honestly, Fabi was probably looking at this and thinking, I don't know if I can get the win here, because there's kind of this repetition. King moves, take here, check. King moves, take here. Engine saying 0.8, but practical chances, this might not be winning for White. Instead, he plays rook to e4. He's trying to keep play on the board. We see 3 minutes for Dominguez Perez, and we're on move 31. So they have 9 moves to make time control, 9 minutes for Fabi. So these players are always watching the clock, using that to calculate their practical chances for a win. Rook d8, knight g6 check. This pawn is pinned, so the king moves. Rook to d4. Takes the knight. Rook takes, f takes. So we get this cool imbalance, queen for 2 rooks. Oftentimes, when you calculate queen for 2 rooks, you look at the king safety and the targets. In this position, black's king is very safe and there aren't any good targets. White's king is also pretty safe and there aren't any good targets. So really it's close to equal. Pawn to a4, a6. The a pawns trade off, g6. And now we see the players are starting to trade. They decide to repeat. Neither side really had anything to play for at this point. Draw agreed. So big miss by Fabiano. Let's look at the chart. 93 accuracy by both, but here's that segment somewhere around a 3, 4, even 5 point advantage right here. Largest advantage in the game if Fabi finds pawn to f6. All right, let's move on to Levon Aronian with the white pieces, Magnus with the black pieces. We see a Bogo Indian with the early bishop check, pawn to d5. So this is kind of like a Queen's Gambit decline structure, except now we have the dark squared bishop traded off. And usually you would think this favors white, because this is white's good bishop, that's black's bad bishop. But in practice, black is able to find ways to solve the problem with that bishop. So let's see what happens. Takes, quick c5, rook d8. So black is utilizing the fact that this king is still in the center, getting quick development. Bishop comes back, queen a5. Black really only has to solve the problem of this one bishop. So that's the advantage that white has, the stronger bishop. All the pawns are symmetric. All the pieces are the same. 2 knights each, 2 rooks each, queen each, bishop each. So Magnus just has to solve that bishop. Forces the knight trade. Makes sense. And now we see the bishop sneaks out to d7. If it could get to c6 safely, dead equal. So that's why Levon puts his bishop on f3, not allowing an easy bishop to c6. But after rook c8, the queen is targeted. On to b6. That bishop is almost free. Queen c5. Queens come off. So now we're kind of reaching this endgame. It's pretty safe for black after rook c8. This is a sign that Levon is good with the draw. Right? He's just saying, I'm going to trade off the last rook. No targets for my bishop. No targets for your bishop. Super GM draw. We're at move 24. They play 12 more moves, but both of these guys know it's a draw the whole way. They're just trying to play it out a little bit. All right, so 36 move draw. Magnus 1.5 out of 2, tied with Hans at this point. Levon on 2 draws so far. Now we have MVL, Maxime Vachier-Lagrave against Wesley So. And we get a Roy Lopez Berlin defense with knight f6. And we're headed towards the Berlin endgame. So this is all theory still. The idea with the Berlin endgame is black accepts the doubled pawns, but he has the bishop pair. He loses the castling rights, but he's okay with that because there's a lot of like positional stuff that black can do with the bishop pair and kind of playing on the flanks. Like we see this H pawn up. We're following 6 games here still. Now we transpose to 30 games. G5, so aggressive play by Wesley. This is kind of a new move. Let's see who's played this before. Fabiano played this with the white pieces against Chakovenko. Aronian played this with black against Karyakin. And Caruana played this as black against MVL. Oh, so Wesley knows this game, obviously. Bishop h2, rook h6. So Wesley knows that MVL has played this exact line before. Are we still following the game? Not anymore. Okay. So let's switch to analysis. Rook to h6 just played. Rook e1, rook g6. Now we see a trade of knights. So we can still highlight this bishop pair for black. The double pawns for black. White has the extra e pawn. And this is kind of, you see this type of move, throw a pawn up on e6. This is essentially where white is saying, okay, I'm going to shut down the play of your bishop pair. This is a nice bishop pointing at h3. It's supporting this kingside pawn storm. I'm going to play e6 and shut down the bishop. This happens a lot in the Berlin. Now the bishop pair advantage is gone. We reach this endgame. Wesley is up 1 pawn, but it's this free pawn on c7. Now we're equal. Super GM. Equal position. Only difference now is these 2 pawns, really. It's a very, very slight advantage for white, but it's not enough to make anything. So let's see what happens. That pawn takes, but it's via tactics. Black gets all the activity. And they kind of just swapping pawn for pawn here. There's not a lot to show in terms of the engine eval. Some little tactics. Now we get a 2 versus 3. The Super GM level, this is almost always a draw. It should be a draw, and it's 46 minutes versus 41. And MVL doesn't even attempt to play for a win. He knows Wesley can hold this draw all day long with 42 minutes. So these players are both super solid. You look at the chart, 98 to 98 accuracy, just a straight line. All right, let's go to the next game. Oh, that was the last game, I think. So Wesley, Jan, Bobby, Shaq, and Magnus. Okay, let's look at the standings. So now, going to the standings, Magnus Carlsen, first place, 1.5 out of 2, tied with Hans Niemann. Super cool. I'm really excited to see Hans up here on the leaderboard. We have a big tie, 3rd through 8th, with even scores. And then Mamedyarov and Ali Reza are looking to get back to equal if they can win their next games. And going to the schedule, today is Saturday, round 2. We will be back with a recap tomorrow, Sunday, for round number 3. Thank you guys for watching, and I will see you for tomorrow's recap.